In a tense courtroom filled with murmurs of anticipation, the atmosphere was thick with unease. At the center of it all stood Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, her presence commanding yet calm as she prepared to face a judge known for his hostility toward progressive figures. Judge Marshall Davis, a man with a reputation for wielding his gavel as a weapon rather than a tool of justice, sat perched at his bench, his expression already twisted with disdain. From the moment Omar entered, it was clear he had no intention of treating her fairly. His sharp gaze followed her every move, his fingers drumming impatiently on the bench, as if waiting for an opportunity to pounce. "This isn't Congress, Ms. Omar," Davis sneered as she took her seat. "In my courtroom, your title means nothing." His words carried an unmistakable venom, laced with a deep-seated bias that even the court observers couldn't ignore. A few exchanged glances, sensing that this was no ordinary trial. Davis, notorious for his thinly veiled contempt for progressive politicians, had made no secret of his disdain for Omar in the past. Now, given the power of the bench, he saw his chance to humiliate her in a setting where he believed his authority was absolute. But Omar was not one to be easily intimidated. She met his glare with steady eyes, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. The case before them was straightforward, a legal dispute tied to charitable contributions. But Davis had other plans. He scoffed at the documents the defense presented, interrupting each argument with increasing hostility. Every time Omar spoke, he found a way to cut her off, his words dripping with condescension. "I'll be the judge of what's relevant here," he snapped when her attorney tried to lay out key evidence. The prosecutor, clearly uncomfortable with Davis's blatant partiality, shifted uneasily in his seat. The judge's bias was becoming too obvious to ignore. However, what Davis didn't know was that his iron grip over the courtroom was about to slip. Omar had come prepared, not just with the truth, but with evidence so damning it would shake the very foundation of his authority. Within moments, the tides would turn, and the man who sought to diminish her would soon find himself fighting for his own freedom. The air in the courtroom grew heavier by the second, tension building as Judge Marshall Davis glared down from his bench, his fingers tightening around the gavel. Whispers rippled through the gallery as Ilhan Omar sat with quiet composure, unshaken by the judge's obvious hostility. Davis had made his distaste for her clear before she had even spoken a word. But now, as the proceedings officially began, his disdain erupted into something more aggressive, an open display of bias that left even seasoned legal professionals shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I don't have time for political theatrics," Davis snapped, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "Ms. Omar, you may be used to dodging questions in front of cameras, but I expect direct answers in my courtroom." The remark, laced with derision, sent a ripple of murmurs through the audience. Omar remained calm, her hands folded neatly before her, refusing to be baited by his provocations. Her attorney rose to speak, but Davis immediately raised a hand to silence him. "Spare me the grandstanding," he barked. "If your client thinks she can spin a story to suit her agenda, she'll find that I am not as easily manipulated as the people who vote for her." A hush fell over the room. The statement was beyond unprofessional. It was personal. Even the prosecutor, who had so far remained quiet, furrowed his brow at the judge's blatant disregard for decorum. "Your Honor," Omar's attorney attempted. Again, his voice measured. "We're simply here to establish the facts." "Facts?" Davis let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Facts are not something I expect from someone like her." He flicked his wrist toward Omar, dismissing her with a casual cruelty that sent a wave of discomfort through the courtroom. Still, she remained unshaken. "If you'd allow me to present my testimony," Omar said finally, her voice clear and unwavering. "I believe you'll find that the truth speaks for itself." Davis's expression darkened. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the bench as if to steady himself. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his irritation bubbling dangerously close to the surface. At that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a battle. And despite the judge's power, it was a battle he might not be prepared to win. Judge Marshall Davis's irritation simmered beneath the surface, his gavel tapping impatiently as he fought to maintain control. Across the courtroom, Ilhan Omar remained composed, her expression calm despite the overt hostility radiating from the bench. Every time she or her attorney attempted to speak, Davis interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. It was clear that this was not just a legal matter to him, this was personal. "You can drop the righteous act, Ms. Omar," he sneered, flipping through a stack of papers as if barely interested in what she had to say. "I've seen plenty of politicians, like you, try to twist the law to their advantage. It won't work here." Omar met his glare, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I am here to present the truth, nothing more," Davis scoffed. "The truth?" He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "That's a matter of perspective, isn't it?" The gallery stirred uneasily. Even those unfamiliar with courtroom proceedings could sense the judge's animosity was clouding his judgment. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with how far Davis was pushing the limits of professionalism. But the judge pressed on, unwilling to relinquish his authority. "You expect me to believe that these so-called financial documents prove anything?" Davis demanded, slamming his hand down on a folder of evidence Omar's legal team had submitted. "Let me make one thing clear. I decide what's relevant in my courtroom." Omar, unfazed, gestured toward the documents. "Then let's discuss them." Davis's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to discuss." "On the contrary," Omar said smoothly, "the transactions outlined here paint a very clear picture of corruption, one that leads directly back to you." A hush fell over the room. Davis's face, already flushed with irritation, paled slightly. His fingers twitched against the armrest of his chair. For the first time, his confidence faltered. "What are you implying?" he snapped, his voice a fraction sharper than before. Omar's attorney rose, holding up a file. "Your Honor, these records indicate that financial contributions from offshore accounts were funneled into judicial campaigns, including yours, on the same days certain rulings were issued." Davis's breath hitched, his grip tightening around the gavel. "This is absurd," he spat. "Completely irrelevant." Omar tilted her head slightly. "Irrelevant or inconvenient?" The judge's reaction was immediate. Too immediate. He slammed his gavel down so hard the sound echoed through the chamber. "I will not allow this courtroom to be turned into a political circus." But the damage was done. His panic was evident. His dismissiveness had turned into defensiveness, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. What had started as a show of dominance had quickly unraveled into something else entirely: desperation. Judge Marshall Davis's mask of authority was slipping. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the documents in front of him, flipping through them with forced indifference. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs of casual observation, was now silent. Everyone could feel the shift in power. Ilhan Omar remained steady in her seat, her eyes locked on the judge, watching as his composure cracked with every second that passed. "These allegations are baseless," Davis barked, his voice sharper than before. "Fabrications meant to distract from the real issue at hand." But the conviction in his tone was gone. The confidence, the arrogance, it had drained from him the moment Omar's attorney presented the financial records. Omar leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "Then perhaps you can explain the transactions, Your Honor." Davis's face twitched. He knew what was coming next. Her attorney stood, holding up a new document. "We have records of large, unexplained deposits into offshore accounts. The same accounts tied to rulings that consistently favored corporations and political donors." He stepped closer. "Your rulings." Davis opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The prosecutor, who had remained largely passive until now, suddenly sat upright, his eyes scanning the records in front of him. He, too, saw the pattern, one that could no longer be ignored. "That doesn't prove anything," Davis muttered, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. Omar raised an eyebrow. "No? Then why do these same donors have direct ties to the Liberty Foundation?" a group that has openly lobbied for verdicts in their favor. The judge slammed his gavel down again, this time with unmistakable desperation. Enough! I will not have my courtroom hijacked by baseless accusations. Baseless? Omar's attorney flipped to another page. This account received $150,000 the same day you dismissed the Wilson case. Another deposit, $200,000, right before you ruled against a small business owner being sued by a corporate donor. The list goes on, Your Honor. Davis was gripping the edge of his bench so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He shook his head, but his protests lacked the force they once carried. His usual booming voice had withered into a weak, unconvincing denial. "You don't understand," he stammered. "These were legitimate contributions." "To you," Omar interrupted, her voice sharp. "Contributions made not for justice, but for favorable rulings. This isn't about the law, Your Honor. This is about power, and you've abused it for too long." The courtroom was holding its collective breath. Even the security officers stationed near the doors seemed uncertain of what to do. The balance of power had shifted completely. Judge Davis, once the most feared figure in the room, now looked like a man trapped with no escape. His mouth opened again, this time in rage. "You think you can come in here and—" Before he could finish, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A team of FBI agents entered, their presence like a thunderclap cutting through the tension. Judge Davis's face drained of all color. He knew in that moment that it was over. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom burst open with a sharp creak, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. A team of FBI agents strode in, their presence sending a wave of unease rippling through the room. The lead agent's badge glinted under the fluorescent lights as he stepped forward, his expression unreadable but resolute. "Judge Marshall Davis," the agent announced, his voice firm, unwavering. "This court is now under federal investigation. Please step away from the bench." The color drained from Davis's face. His once imposing presence now looked fragile, his hands gripping the sides of his bench as if holding on to the last shred of power he had left. The room fell into a stunned silence. The only sound the distant clicking of cameras from reporters who had sensed that this was no ordinary hearing. "You can't do this," Davis sputtered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I am a federal judge. I have immunity." The lead agent remained unfazed. "Not from criminal misconduct, Your Honor." The judge's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an escape, a lifeline, anything. His gaze landed on the court officers near the door. "Guards!" he barked, slamming his gavel down so hard the wood splintered. "I am ordering you to remove these men from my courtroom immediately." But the officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. The weight of the evidence, the undeniable trail of corruption, had turned the tide. Davis, once the absolute authority in this room, was now merely a man cornered by his own misdeeds. "This is a setup," Davis snarled, his voice a mixture of rage and panic. His eyes locked onto Ilhan Omar, as if searching for someone to blame. "This is a politically motivated attack, a witch hunt." Omar, still seated, didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze with quiet resolve. "No, Your Honor," she said evenly. "This is justice." The words landed like a hammer, and for the first time Davis had no retort. His mouth opened, then closed. The fight was draining from him, replaced by a dawning realization of what was happening. The FBI agent took another step forward. "Judge Davis, you are being charged with obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You will be taken into federal custody for further questioning." Davis staggered backward, shaking his head violently. "No! No! No! You don't understand! The foundation! They made me do it!" He was unraveling now, his voice rising, his hands trembling. "If I talk, I'm a dead man!" The courtroom erupted in gasps. A deeper conspiracy, hidden in the shadows of Davis's corruption, had just begun to reveal itself. "Then I suggest you start talking," the agent replied coldly, signaling for his men. Two officers stepped forward, their cuffs gleaming as they seized Davis's wrists. The snap of metal echoed through the chamber. Judge Marshall Davis, once the untouchable authority in his courtroom, was now nothing more than another defendant, his fall from power complete. The courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence as Judge Marshall Davis was led away, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. His face, drained of color, was a mask of disbelief. The very authority he had wielded so mercilessly had been stripped away in an instant. As the FBI agents escorted him past the gallery, reporters scrambled to capture the moment. A man who once ruled from the bench, now shackled like the very criminals he had sentenced. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the street, their cameras trained on the doors, waiting for the disgraced judge to emerge. Within minutes, headlines would spread like wildfire. Federal judge arrested in explosive corruption scandal. The very scandal that he had spent years ensuring would never come to light, but the fallout extended beyond the man himself. As investigators combed through court records and financial transactions, a much darker truth emerged. Davis wasn't the only judge involved. The money trails led to an entire network of judicial corruption, one that had influenced countless rulings. Case after case was reopened, exposing a system that had been manipulated in favor of those who could pay for justice rather than earn it. One of the first cases overturned was the very one that had brought Ilhan Omar to court. The charges were dismissed within hours, the truth now impossible to ignore. Innocent people who had been wrongfully sentenced under Davis's rulings came forward, their stories eerily similar. Business owners crushed under unfair verdicts, activists silenced, lives ruined by a justice system that had been for sale all along. Omar watched as the wheels of real justice finally began to turn. She had come into the courtroom expecting resistance, knowing full well the battle would be uphill, but she had stood firm, unwavering in the face of intimidation, and now the weight of corruption was finally crumbling under its own arrogance. As she stepped outside, reporters swarmed, microphones and flashing lights bombarding her with questions, but she paused only for a moment before offering a simple, steady response. "No one is above the law." The words carried through the crowd, sending a ripple through the nation. The fight against corruption was far from over, but today, justice had won. As the last echoes of the judge's downfall settled over the courtroom, a sense of finality filled the air. What had begun as yet another display of unchecked power had ended in a stunning reversal, one that would be remembered for years to come. But the significance of the moment stretched beyond the walls of this courtroom. It was a reminder, a warning, and most importantly, a victory for those who had long been silenced by a system built to favor the powerful. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters, their voices overlapping as they fought to capture the gravity of what had just unfolded. The arrest of a sitting federal judge was no small event, and the implications were already spreading. Investigations were underway, more names were being connected to the corruption ring, and the legal world was bracing for the shockwaves to follow. Ilhan Omar stood at the top of those steps, taking in the scene. The flashing cameras, the murmurs of a country waking up to a reality it could no longer ignore. She had walked into that courtroom as a witness, but she had walked out as something more, a symbol of resistance against a system that had long operated in the shadows. When she finally spoke, her words were deliberate. This was never about politics. This was about justice, and justice must apply to everyone, no matter their title, no matter their influence. A hush fell over the crowd as her words sank in. It was a statement of truth, one that couldn't be spun or dismissed. The courtroom had been a battleground, but it was just one of many. The fight for fairness, for real accountability, was far from over. As she turned to leave, a voice from the crowd called out, "What happens next?" Omar paused, then looked directly into the cameras. "That's up to us," she said. "Corruption survives when we look the other way. Today we didn't. Tomorrow we can't." With that, she walked away, leaving the weight of her words behind. And as the courthouse doors closed, the message was clear. This was not the end. It was only the beginning.